Welcome to Fighting the World.
I hadn't seen that
yet. All right. So, story time with Wistric, because it's the intro. I like to win my fights before Leon is called. And Bruce likes things to be just efficient. The best way to win is to have the most people there. So when it comes to melee, there's this quote that I like. Numerical superiority is of no consequence. In battle, victory will go to the best tactician. That was George Armstrong Custer, who died due to a significant lack of numerical superiority. So really, how do you get people there? Logistics, planning. It's what gets you the most fighters with the right skills and the right information in the right place at the right time, so that when generals come up with their tactics and their strategies, they can pretend that that's what made the difference. So tonight, we're going to talk through how do chiefs of staff in the armies make the logistical difference that brings victory.
All right.
The intro said, this is Fighting the World with me, Wistric.
And me, Bruce, and we're so happy to have you here tonight. All right, so looking at our outline, Wistric wanted us to give our credentials today, and I think both of us came to this, I won't say unwillingly, but we saw a gap that needed to be filled, and we're dragged screaming and kicking into the void. So I don't use my titles very often, but I am Baroness Alessandra Brucioli, XO to the Midrealm Army. But before I was XO, I was Chief of Staff for, I had to do the math this morning, 5 years for the Midrealm Army. The term is usually 2, maybe 3 years. I'm a little bit tired, but I definitely know how many people each kingdom are going to bring to Pennsic. And I'm going to hand it over to Wistric to give his credentials, since this is apparently important.
Well, people should know whether or not we're better for anything than asking experts questions. Because now it's us asking each other questions. This is weird.
Ew.
So I was back in Atlantia where I started. I was the Southern Regional Commander for 6 years or so. And Atlantia's big word is Pennsic. So that meant a lot of coordinating the part of the kingdom that was furthest away from Pennsic, figuring out how many people were going to show up, making sure they had all the information that was being developed 5 hours north of me, 8 hours north of some of them. And that all of the information got exchanged back and forth. So a lot of head counts, a lot of just documentation. Moved to Meridies, and it was at a time where the Meridian militia was evolving, and the commander in 2015 was like, you know what, we're not a militia, we are an organized body, and changed the name to the Meridian Watch, because hey, we've got units, we've got companies, and dragged me in at that point to start helping organize it. And then up until 2017, when I was the general for the Meridian Rapier Army, the first time that Meridies was a primary at war, at Gulf Wars. So yeah, I've got a lot of experience doing a lot of head counts, paperwork, communication, just so that people know how many bodies are going to be there from which group when people actually call Leon.
Hey, it's an important job, and if the Midrealm hadn't had that job built in specifically for me, I probably would have been in a very similar boat, sitting there like, how can I help? And it really does. If you start having an organized army, you need that person there to do the counts, to figure out what type of games you can play, and figure out how to be better at melee instead of just a bunch of dudes in a line. So
all the training. Yeah, we had an episode on training. We had an episode on forming units and making a unit that lasts. But all of that has to be coordinated. up the chain of command.
So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about the macro and the micro scale of making that job easier, of getting more bodies on the field in an organized manner and in a sustainable manner. But before we really dive into that, if you haven't noticed, we have a little bit of a different format tonight, but it's still the same old Fighting the World. We will be doing a Zoom meetup afterwards. Please make sure you post your questions, your comments, whatever you're feeling on Facebook Live or on YouTube. We'll see them here. Also, make sure that you thank Kal-bardr, who is helping us and hosting us tonight with all this technical stuff, because we know how to count good, not so certain on the Zoom meetings and the recording. So please,
if you were there for episode 4 live, you know.
Lots of old man schlong.
Oh, man.
Never again. But we just want to say thank you to Kal-bardr. Make sure you drop him a thank you as well if you enjoy it tonight. Let us know what you think about the format. I know we're doing something a little different tonight where we're just talking to each other, but we're hoping that we can touch on some things that we know a lot about, and maybe in the future we can do a few more of these with maybe something a little bit sillier. Not that we were already talking about this today. So to get us really started, we need to kind of do an overview of what actually happens at war. Why do we need the logistics? And I'm going to start with Wistric because Gulf Wars is his area of expertise and Pennsic is mine, and they're both totally different animals, and I have talked enough. So Wistric, take it away.
Well, they are totally different animals, and the Gulf Wars is a better place to start because it's a little smaller, it's a little more laid back, it's a little less organized than the symphonic production that is Pennsic. For those who don't know, Gulf Wars is held in March down in Mississippi. I was actually loading my car this year when it got canceled because of COVID. It was sad, but it was the right thing to do, and I say that as the deputy rapier marshal in charge. So usually it's March, it's great weather, it's 45 minutes from New Orleans, so it has all sorts of appeal. About 2,000 people turn up. We get on the rapier field sides of 100 against 100, 150 against 150. Usually it is Trimaris against Anstior. With Glenaben and Meridier as also as hosts, but it's those two kingdoms are the primaries, and they line up the allies, and their royals discuss the scenarios. Schedule and scenarios are pretty consistent year over year. We have field battle, ravine battle, and they've done a town battle sort of thing as the third option. That one can change around a bit and sometimes gets weird. Usually the big thing that messes things up and throws things into confusion is the weather. Like the time that a tornado rolled through on Thursday. And then back in 2019 even, weather washed out the ravine, so they had to come up with an entirely new scenario day of. It was exciting. The standard way the week plays out, you get the head count, everybody from both sides, generals from both sides, heavy and rapier, kings, royals from both sides get together on Sunday and they get the head count. They say, Meridiers, how many people did you bring? And we brought this. One year our king said, oh yeah, Meridiers always brings 200, which everybody in the room knew was not the case, except our king. So that was, luckily they did not write that number down. This is why you bring the generals, because they turned to the Meridian general and said, how many people? And then after that, you've got the schedule in hand. Usually you get together with, each side gets together with their commanders, huddles up, figures out the week. And then usually there is the every night before the battle command meeting. So, and then at the end, nobody knows who wins because It's a battle of friends. It's a war of friends.
Hey, not my war, not my problem. Plus, we're usually packing out by the time they announce who wins, so we can do the 21-hour drive home. So, Wistric, I actually have a couple of questions from your spiel as you drink water very gracefully.
Usually,
right.
We have panelists talking, and I'm over here.
I know. That's why I don't have to worry about how drunk we're going to get by the end, because we have no time to drink right now. But so you talked about negotiations and scenarios being set. With Gulf Wars, when do negotiations happen? Like, how far in advance do you know these things?
The royals of the two sides are set by November, October. And so that's when communication starts. That's when they've stepped up. And really before that, you even know who the heirs are going to be. So they can talk to each other. All of that communication happens through email sometimes, Facebook Messenger sometimes, depending on what everybody involved prefers. Ideally, the royals of all four kingdoms, all royals of all the four kingdoms, the host kingdoms, are included. The marshals for the activities are included. Royals have whims, and so things don't always go ideally. But yeah, by the time they get to publishing the book, they've all agreed we're going to do. Are we going to do the woods battle or the ravine battle? Of course. Okay, are we going to do it lengthwise or crosswise? Because it really is two different battles. It's a much narrower battle in a V. If you're going lengthwise, it's two very long lines running downhill into a V if you're going crosswise. The field battle is the same field battle every year. Hawk as Rapier Marshal is lobbying to improve it. We're going to keep that up. And there's no Gulf Wars 2021, but Gulf Wars 2022. Trying to get a larger field, trying to kind of do what the heavies do, which they rotate 90 degrees instead of just pitching 180. And in general, negotiate out all of that stuff. Are we going to change anything? Nope. Same thing as last year. Yep.
Do the royals make that call, or do the generals get involved? Like, what does that negotiation? Who does that involve? It's all the royals?
Yeah.
Okay.
As when I was general, I was not pulled into that at all, really.
Okay.
So again, some years may be different, but the 2020 was not substantially different. I don't know that generals were involved in that at all. Yeah.
We have years like that with Pennsic as well. It's just fewer and farther between, just because there's so many more bodies to move. So how large is Gulf Wars normally when it comes to combatants, like rapier combatants on the field?
We had, I think it was about 150 against 150 the year that I was in charge, and then I was off for the next 2 years. Because kid. But yeah, we had about 150 against 150. Some years it's been lower. I've been going since 2010. I've seen much smaller. In 2010, when I went, all the melees were on the same day. All the rapier battles were on Wednesday. They've spread it out over the week. And I think we've seen more attendance because of that, and a more enjoyable week. You can't just show up on Wednesday and then go home. So it was like 100 against 100 back 10 years ago. Now we're up to 150.
All right, fabulous. So that gives us a really good idea about the scale and the format and a bunch of the other things that are kind of important with what we're going to dive into a little bit later tonight. Hopefully, maybe, if we don't get too distracted. So I just like to remind.
If we get distracted, it'll be by something fun.
Don't you dare nerd snipe me. I learned what that meant. All right.
You learned that word 20 minutes ago because you nerd sniped me by sending me an article about tactic and strategy in the Avengers. And that is really like And I responded with similar firepower. And that's the sort of thing that she and I just geek out about. And we're both we've been thinking about that and not getting ready for the show.
Yep. Oops. All right. So just, like our wonderful moderator has popped up below. As you guys join us, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat. We can see them all, which is really awesome. And I am going to dive. That was not my war, aka Gulf Wars.
Which war is yours?
Ugh. So Pennsic. A little bit of background from me. I'm from the East Kingdom originally, and I moved to the Mid for law school, which was a terrible decision. Don't go to law school. Don't be a lawyer. When I moved to the Mid, I made a little bit of a splash because I don't think they were ready for all of this. But I found when
Who really is?
no one is ready for all of this. But for anyone who hasn't been to Pennsic, Pennsic is usually a war between the East, so the East Coast, and the Midrealm, the Midwest. Sometimes Aethelmark gets involved.
There's East Coast that's not like it is in fact south of Pennsylvania.
Okay, the top of the Northeast. It's New York and Massachusetts and Jersey
Being
and
from the named the South. There are feelings.
You're not helping. I'm going to hurt someone's feelings. But usually it is a war between the East and the Mid. It has been it is our longest running war. And sometimes the principles will shift. So it'll be Aethelmark in the known world versus the East and the Mid. But usually, I would say 9 times out of 10, if you look at the statistics, it has been East versus Mid. And I found when I would go back to Pennsic, which was kind of the come home event because I had a household back East, everyone from the Mid was really surprised at all the Easties I knew, because imagine that, I came from the East, and all the Easties were really surprised about the number of the Mid people I knew because I moved to the Mid. Very shocking. But when our army was starting to look for a new chief of staff, which I will go into here in a minute, they pinged me because there was this really weird idea that I knew everyone, which I don't. It's not true. But Pennsic for scale is about 250 on 250 rapier combatants for each scenario. It is a week-long war. And the Midrealm handles the scale of being a principal and the infrastructure it takes for fielding that many fighters and making sure that 500 people, your bestest friends, are having a good time. With that infrastructure, it is seriously set up that if someone were to not make it to Pennsic, there would be 2 or 3 people who could potentially step into their place. We run it with a war general who is the general of both the heavy and the rapier. He or she is the overarching in-charge person. Next step down is going to be the Kingdom Rapier Commander, since we're going to go down that kind of branch. And then for the Rapier Commander, there's an executive officer who is their people hate this phrase, they're drop dead. No, not true. I do not know everybody. The XO is the drop dead. That's the person training to be the next Rapier General. And then from there, you have the Chief of Staff, who is the data analyst. The cat herder is the joking name that we gave it. They collect all the data from the various regions, which the Midrealm is divided into 5 regions, which each have their own commander as well. So as you can see, it's a pyramid scheme. No, it's a pyramid. And we have at the top the general, the XO, and then the chief of staff who help keep the general and the XO's head on. I think I was jokingly called someone's hard drive during my course of the chief of staff. So chief of staff does the data gathering. They collect the information on the current rapier fighters of the Midrealm. They collect the information on the current rapier fighters of the allies. They collect all of the contact information so we can find each other at Pennsic, because it is such a large event and chaotic. I mean, 10,000 plus people? Is that the count last year? I don't remember exactly, or 2 years ago now.
And that was like, everybody usually says, yeah, it's like 10,000 people. It's usually 11. So.
Yeah, my friends are helping.
Yeah, the comments are calling you out a lot.
These people are very, very helpful. I was chief of staff under Mara Eriksdotter, who is hanging out in the chat talking about how we exist, the XO exists so that some rando doesn't wake up in charge of something after a very drunken night, which has happened. So that all being said, the Midrealm deals with being a principal in a very large, complicated war situation in which 500 people's fun time vacation rides on infrastructure and logistics by basically over planning the crap out of everything. We data gather. We help during negotiations. The chief of staff does by collecting information on what the regions enjoy doing, what they don't enjoy doing, what we want to learn how to do. That's brought into the negotiations for what the Pennsic scenarios will look like sometimes. A little less weight because sometimes, as Wistric said about Gulf Wars, you get overly enthusiastic royals who want to either help Rapier or win the war or reenact the Battle of 1812. Like, I don't know, you get some really crazy stuff. But negotiations for Pennsic are negotiations for Pennsic can be really, really complicated because you have the royals involved, you have so many people involved in wanting to come and play. You have so many different kingdoms with so many different rule sets as well. So a lot of the things that are okay to do in, say, Atlantia might not be okay in the Midrealm, or might not be okay in the Outlands, or may not be okay in the East, or Lockhack with metal spears. Like, a lot of that stuff has to be written into the rules for Pennsic, so someone doesn't show up and go, I'm going to play with my metal spear at an event where they're not legal. Once negotiations are done and we know what our scenarios look like, there'll be even more training. And then once we get to war, it's a whole nother animal because you finally find out how many people are actually showing up from each kingdom. You have to figure out how to use them. So there are command meetings every night to talk about the logistics and about how you're going to play these scenarios. And then before battles, you got to keep everyone honest. So we take full troop counts before battles. As the cannon is timing down because you want it to be as close as possible to lay on the field. And then afterwards, we actually collect data on what?
Dots.
Dots? What?
Were you
No.
there for that year that everybody got one of those little round dot stickies?
That was before my time as chief of staff, so I didn't care.
Okay, yeah. It was just so that they could count out. You know, we have 50 dots on a sheet. Everybody come get a dot. Okay, we have gone through 3 sheets. That's 150. Great. Well, let's double check. Okay, everybody bring your dots up here. We threw away our dots because you said we could. Well, then everybody line up and come get a dot. That is what happens when Bruce is not the chief of staff.
No, that's what happens. Overcomplicate a scenario, which we will get to later tonight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the last step in data gathering for the chief of staff for Midrealm, and specifically for Midrealm, we do something called AARs, which for anyone who's not in the military is an after-action report. We'll actually all sit down and talk about what happened on the field with our various regions. And we have a form for it because we're the Midrealm and we have paperwork for everything. Sorry, Midrealmers. But it's true. So we'll talk.
Can I get a copy of that form?
I'll show it to you tonight. Hold it up. But we like to talk about what happened on the field so that we can improve the game for everyone, whether it's to shift it more towards winning and being better at melee or shift it towards more fun for our regions. It just kind of depends on who's in charge that year. Anyway, okay, that is so much information and I am so sorry. I just talked for like 10 minutes straight. I have a tendency to do that. No, I don't know, everyone. But I'm going to shift it over to Wistric because none of this stuff would be possible or necessary if we couldn't have people on the field. So what are some of the ways, Wistric, that you know of to minimize the burden on attendees at war? Because that's actually kind of one of the bigger problems.
Some of the easiest things to do to get people there. If you want people to show up, helping them usually helps them show up. So I did want to touch on the Midrealm Scholarship, and Trimaris has a similar scholarship program where, you know, you take up collections so that the young college kids who can't afford anything can make it to war. And those are usually your guys who can fight all day, run around all day, don't mind risking breaking an ankle in the woods. So that's a good investment. And that's a thing that is super coordinated behind the scenes. It happens between wars, not at wars. I've never gotten a peek at how it's organized. Bruce, if you know, please, you know, heads up.
So I have a little bit of information about the Midrealm Scholarship Fund. So first, it is not an official SCA thing. It cannot be an official SCA thing. This is a private fundraiser and scholarship that is run by Maestra, I believe that's the title she's going by Mistress Mirabai Sit Al-Sir. She was formerly general. She was formerly chief of staff, like 3 ago? 3 ago. And she's absolutely fabulous. But in between, we have what we call melee season here in the Midrealm. So February is when it starts, and it doesn't end until after Pennsic. That is when all of the melee stuff is happening. And during that time, she begins doing fundraiser stuff. So and it's branched out. I know Mara has done snow cones. I've done a hot chocolate pepper eating challenge with Vindis, who's actually in the chat. Thank you, Vindis. My stomach is still not the same. We've done silent raffles. We've sold popcorn at Crown Tournament. All sorts of fundraisers. And what we do is at the end, Mirabai puts out a survey and asks people if they need help getting to Pennsic. They fill out a form and no questions asked, she will pay for their gate fee for Pennsic. That's how it works here in the Midrealm. We do fundraising. Some years we have more funds to give, some years we don't, and it just all rolls over as we go. I know when I was poor law student my first year and couldn't hold a job because of weird rules, I had to actually take advantage of that. And it was amazing. It really helped me get past that big bump of spend. And once I was at Pennsic, my friends all took care of me because that's how the SCA works. If you know a lot of, I am really stepping on my own self about the knowing everyone, but that's what happens when you make friends. And one of the biggest and most important things you can do if you are trying to build up melee and build up group friendship is
yeah, the lesson of the night is that Bruce lies about certain things.
Hey, my
big takeaway.
No.
Wait. The big takeaway is that Bruce knows everything.
I wish. But no, the best thing you can do is make friends and make sure that people feel welcome. And that's actually a takeaway from our units episode, was it not? Make sure people feel included.
Keep them friendly when they show up.
Yep. And that's how you get bodies on the field. But
yeah,
if you ever live in the Midrealm,
the next hurdles that people run into is I don't know how to get there. I don't have a way to get there. I don't know where to camp. I don't have a tent. And most of us old farts have 2 tents at this point. Yeah, I've got 2. And one of those is the, luxury circus tent that my lady and I sleep in at Pennsic, but that thing can go to Pennsic or it can go to Gulf Wars. And I can sleep in my other one, and that thing can sleep 8 people. So if we need a tent, then, we have a tent that we can throw people into. And then and transportation. Chuck them on top of the piles of clothing in the back of your car. But the way you get the there are easy-ish ways that just take a little coordination beforehand, a little communication, and lists of this person has a seat in their car, this person has a barracks tent, this person needs them.
So what's a barracks tent, Wistric?
A barracks tent is a big honking tent that you chuck all of the stinky college kids into. It's like my circus tent. It's 12 by 16. You can just line them up like this. But no, when you have, when you don't have a lot of gear or infrastructure, you don't need a lot of space. So you can cram into the corner of somebody's tent. If you have a bunch of those people, they can all share a tent, and then none of them are taking up a lot of space. They have all found a tent. None of them have to solve this problem individually by coordinating. Hey, we solved the problem for them all. They all have somewhere to camp. It's going to be with somebody they know because somebody offered that tent up. And they're going to have somebody then to guide them around Pennsic and Gulf waters. So, it's just connecting the need to the want in advance enough that everybody can get registered for Pennsic.
Solving all the problems.
Logistics.
We're solving all of the SCA's problems. So there's always a discussion about getting new people involved and getting new people to stick around. This might be a suggestion on fixing that. So Wistric, why is it important to get more people involved in Melee?
Because numbers win. George Armstrong Custer was wrong, as he proved with his dying breath. Really, the easiest way to win is to have the most swords in one spot at one time. I wish I had lined up the clip from Princess Bride where it's Inigo and Pennsic and saying, how many could you take on how many could you take? 10, leaving 20 for me. I couldn't do that on my best day. Even Inigo can't take 20 at a time. So, if you just get the warm bodies there, then the general can say, advance, flank, yay! And it turns out that you've just human swarmed them into oblivion, and it's because you had bodies.
No, that's fair. I wanted to touch on that a little bit.
I can go. I'll tell the other quick story where we had a 5-man tourney in Atlantia, because that's what Atlantia do. And they said they had a limit. If you've got a white scarf on the team, then you can only have 3 people. So we got 5 of our high-end non-scarves and named the team Numerical Superiority, and swept, so that the marshal had to say, Numerical Superiority wins every round. And then Numerical Superiority won the tournament. Because it does.
So this is why you need logisticians, is to make sure that people get there and organize. Because as much as I agree with Wistric that numerical superiority wins every time, you have to bring them in an organized manner. If you bring 5 people who have never meleeed before in their lives versus 3 people who have either practiced or know each other, one of our strong units from episode 9, 8, what episode was that? This many? Then you have a little bit more of a problem. So we actually have a question in the chat, and I'm gonna throw it at you, Wistric, because we've had a lot of discussions about parity here in the Midrealm. But if you're trying to even up the sides,
you're gonna make me offend people, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. That's what you're here for, right? Then why should we even discuss bringing more numbers?
I believe sides should be evened up only after the war point has been conceded. I think there's a lot of, especially around Pennsic, there's talk about winning the negotiations war point, negotiating the rules so that you are more likely to win the battle. And then we get there and even up the sides so that everybody has an even chance. But the rules are rigged. If somebody does the work, if one side does the work, if the king is a good king, motivates his army to come out, if the chief of staff busts her ass and makes sure that you get 80% turnout from every single local unit, every single household unit, they deserve to win. If the other side says, we don't think we can win with the numbers the way they are, that's fine. You said you don't think you can win, concede. No shame. At the end of the day, it's all about having fun. It's all about being a war of friends. And reward good work. And don't take victory that seriously.
And that's actually one thing I will disagree with Wistric on, is I think that parity can be utilized efficiently, because if people are just getting ramrodded every year by 2+ other people because, I don't know, Super Duke number 10 from some unforsaken A kingdom over here has decided to win the war point, just doesn't understand rapier or pisses a bunch of people off, that's not a lot of fun. So I personally believe in bringing up the training for as many people as possible and having the most skilled, cohesive side win, which is another reason you need a chief of staff, because a big part of this is gathering the intelligence, is gathering the data on your fighters, your units, what they need to work on, and applying that effectively and efficiently to your kingdom and your kingdom's wants or needs. But I will agree with Wistric that this should be fun, and we take it entirely too seriously sometimes.
Like,
so.
Again, not disagreeing. If you get trained, that should have a reward. That should have whatever reward it can earn.
Right.
If the reward is the other side saying, we think we've lost this before Leon is called, that's okay. Because I think some toxicity creeps in by having too much ego wrapped around whether or not the kingdom you're with gets the war point or doesn't.
And I'm about to do an office pan, and I'm like, here's looking at you, both of my kingdoms. I
was not mentioning any kingdoms' names in particular.
Nope. No, I didn't mention any names. But that's actually one of, I think, our biggest handicaps with Melee and with making it fun for everyone, is how seriously we take it at times. But as I can see in the chat, it appears that some people were actually very excited about having been completely outnumbered. So who knows? Maybe there's a balance in between what both of us think, Wistric.
Right? If you're willing to fight the odds, dude, rock it. You pull that off, you're legend.
Hey,
and I'm not going to deprive anybody of that chance by balancing the sides, unless everybody agrees.
So, and I think that's actually a big part for me is, and I think we can dive into a little bit deeper here, is some of the data gathering. Let's move away from the scenarios in general, and we'll revisit that. But let's talk a little bit about what type of information is important to have in training a force to be ready for a target-rich environment that's apparently more fun, because Vindus is Master Vindus from the Midrealm is definitely not a masochist at all. But let's talk about some of the information we need as chiefs of staff, as people who are doing the logistics, in knowing your own force. What type of information do you collect from your rapier fighters? What do you find is important, Wistric?
So, to speak a little bit to history, again, as I mentioned, in 2014, 2015, the Meridian Militia got reorganized into the Meridian Rapier Watch. And I think the year before that, there had been 10, 15 Meridian fighters at Gulf Wars. In 2015, there were 35 and 20, or maybe 30. 2016, there were 35, 40. And then my year came around. But that was still very triple numbers from what everybody was used to. So I kind of had to start with how many fighters do we actually have? So it turns out you can get a list of how many fighters your kingdom has. It's called it's the list of authorized fencers in your kingdom. So I got that from our marshal, or from our authorization deputy marshal. And then started filling out this chart. What group are they with? And then what unit are they with? You'll notice I flagged some crossovers. Those are heavy fighters who sometimes would authorize rapier to fight, in wars. Maybe they were going to show up, maybe they weren't. Flagged the ones that have the meridian order of the blade, our scarves. People who are going to be de facto leaders or high impact fighters, and might not necessarily stay with whatever unit they are part of. And then Gulf Wars, are they going to Gulf Wars? So how do you find that information out? You go ask their local commanders. We had, again though, Meridian was kind of new to this. So local command structure was a little unsettled. We had our watch commander position. We had 3 regions. Some of our local units had commanders identified. Some didn't. Sometimes you say, "Hey, who's in charge of the rapier unit there?" And they'll say the marshal in charge, which is marshal in charge of safety. Rapier unit commander might not be the best person to be the commander. So a lot of then personal outreach to fill out that chart. Some of this was, Tristram's a person I know in Thor's Mountain. Hey, Tristram, you're in charge of the rapier unit, right? The way you ask the question, people end up volunteering without realizing it, or they end up with the label without ever really choosing it. And then I've got the local group versus what unit they're fighting with, kind of their use. Crossovers, these were heavy fighters who were, like I said, and then first day, because that's going to affect how my strategy based on the schedule. If your field battle is the first day of the war and half your army's not going to be there, that's going to suck, because field battles are one of those where you don't have a terrain advantage. You don't have really any way to play which flag are we going to focus on. It's the human swarm effect, and that's the day you want your numbers. So for those crossovers, if they were, I can give you one battle, Wistric, I want that field battle. Getting coordinated that. And then I flagged those fencers who were authorized to fight spear on the heavy side, because I wanted to start encouraging a culture of mutual support and crossover, because the more fencers they see over there, the more likely they are to pick up a rapier. Crossovers are low-hanging fruit. They already are planning to go to Gulf Wars. They already have a tent and transportation, and you just need to get a sword in their hand and get them authorized. So I started with that list of authorized fighters, and then I went through to all of my local units and local groups. Hey, who's not authorized that's going to be authorized? Okay, great. Who's going to be at Gulf Wars? So that I could then have that command tree that wasn't really formalized before. And what it meant was a lot of, I check with the local contact, whether it's a commander or the marshal, get their updates 5 months out, 6 months out, and then, a couple months later, get firmer numbers. If they're still not sure, start checking with the individuals, because Ridier's, we had 120 authorized fencers at the time, maybe 80 of whom ever actually showed up to fence at events. That's not impossible to do, to look them up on Facebook, message them and say, hey, you can get a Gulf Wars? Maybe. what would help you go to Gulf Wars? And then we're back to, how can I facilitate this?
I'm pretty sure Chief of Staff made me the creepiest Facebook stalker ever.
Yeah, like
well.
if that's and if it's the person who needs to know whether you're going to be there, you just prepare to just message everybody.
So how often are you updating this this list of fighters? Is this every year?
No, that was from my year. I shared it with my successors. I have no idea what they've done with it, if they've made their own copies and passed it on. But that was just my notes for my year as general. We're going to get to tour Bruce's binders. You notice those were Google Drive documents. I love me some Google Drive. I love Google. Not as a corporation, either way. I'm not advertising them, but I love the tools that are available for organization. I was talking about that schedule on which I contacted people. I set up calendar reminders on my Google Calendar. So I just got a ping. It's like, today is the day to circle back with the local leaders. Okay. Ping. Today is the day to remind them if you haven't heard back from them.
So I have a question for you. How did you use that data once you got to war? Like, did it make any determinations in your decisions on how to fight specific scenarios?
So, like I said, war starts with that Sunday where we sat down. My year, it was Meridias and Glenavon against Anstior and Trimaris. The first time that it really happened since there was rapier melee war points. And the head count, the eventual head count, if you total up that Gulf Wars column, was 58. And Glenavon was expecting 15 to 20. I never expected 58 people, because 20% aren't going to make it. It just happens. You get some surprises, but people have life. So I was going in with an estimate of about 40, 45. So we got to that Sunday, Royals, Generals, everybody get together, start coming up with your numbers. And other kingdoms were guessing, where they were saying, yeah, we usually bring this. And I could say, well, we're going to have 45. These are their names. Then, which battle are we doing first? The town battle. Okay, so that can be a little more tactical. We can distribute numbers where we have, if it's the first, it was Monday. We're not going to have our full 45. We're going to have, I think, about 30 that day. Okay, so where do we put them? How are we going to use that? Mora was the Midrealm commander. So she had her numbers, and we had the North Shield commander, and basically we could get the numbers up there, balanced out. And when we get to the field battle, this becomes a funner story. So we had the estimates from all the kingdoms, how many people they're going to bring. And when we got into our command meeting for our side, we could sit there and say, okay, North Shield, you have this many people. Midrealm, you have this many people. We had smaller allies who had 10 to 15, filling in sort of the gaps, and could start saying, okay, do you have a unit that can do X? Do you have a unit that can do Y? Meridias, as I noted, we have had a couple of formed units, but a lot of unaffiliated, kind of disorganized militia still. So I could say, I'm going to have my 8 Arenal speedsters for that field battle. Great, that's enough. I'm going to make them my unit of skirmishers to run across the field, because they're kids. They're all they were in college at that time. They're going to run across the field and go get themselves killed gloriously. They're going to have a great time. I'm going to have a great time. They're going to slow down the enemy long enough for the rest of our line to come up. I have Bryn Matic, which was at that point our largest practice and was kind of college age, early or older millennial mix. And, but they had trained together. They, Natalia, who we had on for the units for the training episode, Natalia was the person who trained up that practice. And so I knew they were steady, and I could say, Brynmatic, go do this job. And I knew that they had enough people to do that job. Like, there are local groups that have really high quality fighters. If 3 of them show up, they're very useful as part of another unit that gets cobbled together from each of the small pieces. And then I have control over quality. So
I have some bad news for you. Your Meridian General is currently in chat and said that they did not receive any of this information from anyone.
He was not my successor.
Well,
I can pull that folder back up and show you who it shared with.
You might want to remedy it in the future. I understand completely. I'm pretty sure we have at least the last.
The Facebook group chat that he's in, where I shared the information that I needed them to know.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get you in trouble.
No, I know exactly what I did. I write everything down because I can't remember shit.
So I definitely.
Again, another reason for Google Docs, because I have everything written down here and can just flip through it as needed.
I definitely have to agree with Wistric on this. Google Docs are a godsend. The chief of staff before me is actually the one who started the Google Drive for us. And now there are at least 5 different people on it, including my successor and his deputy. And we also expanded the information out to the actual general and the XO instead of just to the chief of staff, because we'll touch on this later, but the burden of the job and how much information we were asked to gather and collect was getting out of hand. So it had to be reorganized and accessible to more people so that it wasn't just a constant like, hey, can you pull this really random set of numbers from Pennsic 47 or 46 or 44 or 2013 for us. And it's helped a lot. So yeah, use your tools.
Yeah. And there are also Trello. So what we're talking about is project management at the end of the day. And when I started in command of the Southern region in Atlantia, I was 27, 28. And I had a job, and sometimes I had to do a little bit of project management, and that was the part I hated. And it still is. But that's what I do for my hobby. I run events, and I was a seneschal for my barony, and then I do stuff like this. And like, I have these skills that I've learned from my job, and I still hate using them for a paycheck. But, so there are these project management tools that are out there. Trello is a good one. Once you get, if you learn the concepts of like agile team workflow, you can start sharing boards. And so keeping track of tasks, who's doing what, where is it along the path, who's in charge of it, when does it need to be done by?
And if you're not fancy like him and know what agile is, which thanks to my soul-sucking job, I do. But to-do lists with dates next to them and either reminders in a calendar or Post-it notes, those are my friends, can really help by categorizing when things need to be done, whether it's go for us, and maybe I should have shared my screen, but I didn't want to get in trouble with the command staff, even though I wrote this document. For us,
you should have gone rogue.
I should have gone completely rogue, just get kicked off. No.
You wouldn't have to be CEO.
Wait, no more 1 a.m. command staff meetings? What? But then all the free booze would be gone, and then I'd be sad. But for us, what we do is we actually do a timeline with a checklist of who needs to do what at what time for what event. So we have a Gulf War section, we have a melee season section, we have a Pennsic prep session, and then we have Pennsic itself, and then post Pennsic. And it's shared amongst the entire upper echelon of command, so Chief of Staff, XO, and General, and any deputies there. And then we disseminate those jobs throughout the regionals, which usually their job's pretty easy because they just have to do the AARs and give us head counts and help us ping all of their lovely friends, very much like Wistric said, where he was contacting, I think you called them warlords in your area, to make sure that if people were being authorized, people were being trained, etc. So jumping from that, we've gone over some of the information you collect. The Midrealm does a very similar thing for Pennsic. We do a melee survey every year prior to Pennsic. We're a little more in depth with Gulf Wars. It's just a yes or no answer because there are only about 15, 20 of us, maybe, if we're lucky.
30 in 2017.
Hey,
I came across, like a month ago, I was flipping through my phone and editing out pictures, and I came across the photo I took of the whiteboard in that Sunday meeting. So just like, these are my numbers, cool. And I think it was 30 for the Midrealm. Like, that was a good year for y'all.
2017 was a juicy, juicy year, and I can tell you why. It's because of the king and queen at that point. And some of the stuff they did, which we will touch upon with gathering intelligence here in a minute, some of the stuff they did to get people down to Gulf Wars and as part of a pilgrimage program. It was
if the king watches this, I still owe you a bottle of bourbon.
You who? Edmund or Kellic?
Kellic.
I think you owe Kellic a bottle of bourbon. I doubt he'll be watching this, but if I'll remind him for you.
Somebody will tell him.
But for Pennsic, every year we actually put out a full rapier census, including what region people are from, their SCA name, basically who do they fight with or who do they believe they fight with, and whether or not they actually know their regional commander, because that's actually something very important for us with being such a large kingdom with a large body of rapier fighters going to a large event. Sometimes people don't really know where they're from, especially Johnny Noob who needs the barracks tent, or who might not know that they have a group to fight with on the melee field. And lonely melee isn't much fun. We asked them about what type of weapons they like to bring, because that's a huge consideration in breaking a kill pocket or in some of the more specialized scenarios. If someone's only authorized single, that's fantastic. We want those people. We want them to go hold the flag for us. We want them to help with moving the objectives. We want them running the track meets. Like, we really appreciate those people, and we want to make sure they know they're appreciated. And then we also asked them a little bit about what they like and what they dislike on the field, and if they know these general terminology, so we can tailor make what we do later, which is called a war camp, tailor make our training program so that we're teaching more of the basics of melee out and about. And I know it drives some of the more well-to-do fencers absolutely crazy that we go over the basics every year, but it helps us a lot in rounding out the gaps. And for when we have to deal with parity, which Wistric will roll his eyes on cue, 3, 2, 1.
I'm fine with evening sides.
After
yeah, that side's not going to win this one unless we even sides up.
But we like to tailor make our programs. So
this freaking humbug.
Hey, that's for next episode. I'm the Grinch next episode. But we like to even out the training program so that none of our regions are really left in a lurch, because with how large the Midrealm is and some of our geographical concerns, some regions get a little more melee training than others because it...
How large is the Midrealm?
How big is the Midrealm? The Midrealm goes from Michigan to Kentucky. And then from Pennsylvania, like this side of Pennsylvania, to Indiana.
How long are those drives?
So
that's like, because we have Warwick talking about how it's a 17-hour drive for them to do anything.
So Our longest drive is 9 hours, but that's only because the roads in Ohio are really weird in comparison to the roads in Indiana. So you have to drive straight down Indiana and then straight across Ohio and then up a little bit. But some of our Michigan people have to drive like 13 hours. Sorry, I'm in Chicago. I should have prefaced with that. Some of the roads are really strange, so getting places can take longer, even if it's not far. And I absolutely agree with you, Mara. I'm going to touch on the war camp experience, and hopefully we'll pop this up. Oh, Illinois is not real.
That is reminding her that Illinois exists because she lives in that state.
I don't live in Illinois. No, I do. But the Midrealm is a very strange duck because we have Michigan and because we have Indiana and Illinois, and it just, a lot of the roads don't make sense. So getting people from Michigan, which is one of our regions, Pentamere, down to South Oakland, which is Kentucky, requires a little bit more logistics and a little bit more craziness. We very specifically, after we put out these surveys, put war camps in each region to make sure that people in those regions have the opportunity to get some melee training if they want it before Pennsic, and so that our command staff can get our faces out there, because one of our biggest challenges is making sure that people know that there's actually a command staff, that Pennsic is actually an organized battle thing, and that melee is cool, even though it's not a tournament. Sorry, that was a little snarkier than I intended.
Cool.
What?
You have to teach people that melee is cool?
It makes me very sad, Bruce. Hey, we can't all be Atlantia. We can't all be Atlantia. But anyway, so...
There's the good old days of Atlantia. Yeah, I don't know about today.
So Mara brought up a good point with the war camp. So I want to kind of touch on that briefly before we go into gathering intelligence. And it's going to be a good lead in. So war camps in the Midrealm are convincing people that melee is cool, getting everyone face to face. And as Mara pointed out, it's really building the esprit de corps, which we've talked about in previous episodes. We talked about how important it is that people have fun and get to know each other before going out on the melee field. It can make all the difference in whether or not your unit is effective or a hot mess. Oh, shut up, Trap. We have from the comments saying
I was wondering who that was.
That is Trap. Thank you, Trap. You are a very supportive significant other. Thank you for the house, even though you're not here this week.
At least he's not in the background with his shirt off this time.
I know. You don't get to enjoy shirtless Trap in the background. Anyway, so war camps are how we get training out there. It's how we start our basics, and it's how we make our army cohesive across the entire kingdom. And a lot of our struggle in recent years has been re-implementing that practice. We had generals who were really on top of it and wanted war camps every week in the summer for the entirety of melee season. We've had other generals where it just kind of went by the wayside. We had other kings who didn't want the war camp. Like, it's just a kind of mess of politics, and it really depends on who's in charge at the time.
So how many, you said you have one per region?
That is what we re-implemented last year, 2 years ago.
And how many regions? 5 regions.
Nice. So it's a war camp each region, and then we have a large one kind of at the end, and sometimes that's tied into Simple Day, which is a large event in Indiana, and it's tied into their regional practice. But other times we do the 5, and then we do that one as the come together, everyone, since you're all going to be traveling to this event anyway, and we're going to practice the scenarios as we know them, which kind of leads into our next section and the next thing we kind of wanted to talk about. And Wistric, I'll let you take the lead on this, since I've always been more of the data person and less of the negotiations person. But the next kind of important thing for chief of staff.
So once you know how many people, well, once hopefully you You have an idea of who's going to show up, and then you start having the war camps, but you need to know what you're going to train them for. Like I said, at Gulf Wars, you can predict 2 out of 3 battles are going to be the same every year. Pennsic is about the same. So then the nuances of what rules are going to be in place. Being a former Atlantean, will Pennsic allow running this year? Is always the question. Always the question.
So you missed the funness of that, by the way, in which the entire command staff of the Midrealm sits down and tries to write a definition of running. So just so you know, that happens behind the scenes too.
Yeah, and then Atlantean picks it apart and heckles. Because also, I know some of my Atlantean friends who like that survey that you guys put out, because they like to take it for you also. So you have that information. Not me. I'm not a troll.
Yeah, I pick through it. I know you people. I don't know everyone, but I know some people.
Yeah, we're not going to name names. So yeah, that's Wistric. That's Wistric right there. Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. I'm old. But so, you know, like I said, for Gulf Wars, the negotiations are taking place between the royals. That's nobody gets to know what's going on in there unless they're, you know, part of the end crowd. And nothing gets out, ideally, until it's finalized. Same basic thing going on for Pennsic, except that they also bring in the rapier commanders.
Mm-hmm. Most of the time.
Most of the time. So the sooner you can know what they're going to be and what the rules are going to be, though, the better. So if your commanders are privy to the negotiations, they can start saying, okay, so we're pretty settled on we're going to do this. We're going to allow running, but not in engagement. And, you know, we know we're going to do this, and we're going to use the new woods at Pennsic, or the old new woods at Pennsic, or the old woods at Pennsic. But that's the information you need to be able to train and to start planning. What are we going to train? How are we going to train? What win conditions are we looking for? The year that they said, yeah, we're going to have a battle where we have RBGs. Okay, so we're training RBGs. Gulf Wars is a little different because the commanders are not present for the negotiations, and you know the rapier marshal is from one kingdom, not from all the kingdoms. So what's been really useful there is the rapier marshal has formed a Facebook group where the rapier generals for all the kingdoms are present, and Hawk has been leaking information as it's been settled, as it's been available. But that's the information you need to get ASAP. In the old days, we didn't have a Facebook group, and it was really about who you knew and who was friends with who. And that's why Bruce knowing everybody is actually a little less important now, but was super important then. And like Connor and Atlantia knowing everybody. It was just like, okay, who is in the room where it's happening? Who's at the table? Who knows them? Who can find out all the information that's known at this point and get that information out? And espionage, legit intelligence gathering. But again, you need that to then be able to plan your training and also your strategy. We've had a couple of episodes about scenarios. Once you know it's a scenario, you can break the scenario. So,
and part of the importance of breaking the scenario is making sure that those people you've worked your ass off to have show up know what's going on when they get there and can feel important on the field. So they come back next year with more friends. Plus Melee is cool. I don't care what the chat says.
That's cool. Everybody should. Melee is hella fun. It's a bunch of people who you get to stab. That's why we fence.
So the other reason that this can also be very important is once you know your numbers, once you know your people, you can use this situation, knowing what the rules are, knowing what your scenarios are going to look like, you can use that to enhance your combatants, enhance your assets, if you will. You can make it more fun. You can teach them more things. You can make them more effective if the goal is winning. I'll tell you what my opinion is on that. But we did have a question in the chat about what's the deal with running and negotiating some of these rules out. So with Pennsic, the deal with running is once you have 500 people on a field and they're all running to engagement and you're wearing rapier armor, which is not that padded, there's a lot more potential for concussions and owies and what I lovingly called angel vomit, aka bruises. So you just got to be a little bit careful because the more people you get together to do melee, the dumber they get in large groups, which is part of why you need a logistician, is to kind of minimize the dumb. Wistric might have a different opinion on this, but there
it really is, I think, about the native cultures. And back to Pennsic has been doing rapier war points since they were all using epées, I think. And epées break easy and break into ice picks. And so the concern over, hitting somebody at a run with those is much more significant in my mind. I'm more than willing to run with a rapier. So where do you go to from there? Well, if your culture was established in those days, you're never really training running. First year somebody says, well, let's have running. Well, you haven't had it any year before that, so you haven't had a reason to train it. So if you agree to that, now you go back to the war camps and you have to train how many people in the Midrealm Army?
130.
130 people how to run while fighting safely. And that's not an easy skill. Atlantea's, again, I come from Atlantia, and their attitude is just a little more bruises aren't a problem. to put it mildly, bruises aren't a problem. So they've had a more laid back culture with running, and so you get these conflicts, these interkingdom anthropology conflicts of, are we running at this one? Are we not running at this one? It's a consideration down in Gulf Wars, where we're also, are we going to do DFB or not? Is another big question that comes up in the negotiations for Gulf Wars.
Right. And as a baby Easterner, DFB was a huge part of how I was brought up in melee culture. So when I first went to Gulf Wars, I actually DFB'd like 10 people, and they were just like, "Did you read the rules?" I went, "Yep." And I got
wait, I can't die?
So to answer your question in general, it's to minimize the dumb and get everyone on the same page as you're pulling more and more people out onto these big fields. Like a 5-on-5, it's really easy to talk about conventions in the moment, but as soon as you get more than 10 people on each side, you'd spend your entire time in a hold. So we want to maximize the fun for everyone, how long you get to actually fight melee. All right, so I think that was a good way to kind of touch on that, and why we gather intelligence and where kind of the chief of staff role came from. In some ways, I think in the mid, that delineation goes a little more to the general and the XO, because they're the ones actually doing the scenario breaking itself. And then all of that comes down through the chief of staff looking at what our assets are, how we can use them, and then how we can optimize them. Wow, that sounds really bad. People are not robots.
But they are assets.
They are assets. They're treasures. They're all treasures.
You want to put your gems where they will shine best.
So that's actually kind of takes us into the next thing we wanted to discuss, which was how do we deal with dips and rises in the people showing up to war. Like, what can change the likely turnout and why? And how do we deal with this? Whether it's parity, which, if that's a word you don't know, we can talk about that a little bit. Whether it's parity or just not conceding until the war point is done, or is it training? So Wistric, how do you know you're going to get a lot of people at a war?
I ask my friends in those kingdoms. I mean, like, so the year that I was general, and Stuart was the other side. It's not like I could go to their general, John Drake at the time, and say, how many people are you bringing? But my buddy Avery will gossip with me any day or night. So I went to Avery and I was like, hey, how many people do you think you're going to have? Like, and he was like, it's not going to be a good year. We don't have a popular king right now. Whereas, as was mentioned earlier, that same year, Midrealm had a really popular king and got, twice their normal numbers to drive south all the way down to Mississippi to turn out for the war. The popularity of the royals has a huge effect.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it doesn't just have a huge effect on a kingdom's turnout, it has a huge effect on allies. There was a year that a king of one of the kingdoms at Pennsic pissed off everybody, and had no allies. And that was a 3 or 4 to 1 year. Mm-hmm. And it really sucked to be one of his subjects at that war. Like, they got to stab a lot of people.
But it wasn't much fun.
But the charismatic leadership plays in here. And this is where, the chief of staff can do so much, can keep it, can send out the reminders, can keep the communication up, can keep the information flow going, keep it on people, fresh in people's minds. Because, if I don't have my calendar reminder go off, I don't remember playing until, oh wait, that's today. Organization achieves this much. Charismatic leadership from the general, from whatever leading lights are in the rapier community, and from the royals especially. A king who comes to the rapier community more than once and says, guys, I would, please take the field. Please come down to Gulf Wars. Please turn out. Let's win this one. Let's make Meridies a presence. Will have a huge effect. Like, easily, 10, 20, 25% boost. Kings who take the field with their rapier army. I love them. And rapier fighters. And that gets noticed. The year before I was general, king was Bart, who, I'm going to out him. He was sent to Meridies. He was sent by Meridies to the should we or should we not make the Order of Defense Committee to kill it, because Meridies had some there were some people in Meridies who were did not like rapier, and he was a young knight who was sent to kill it, and he came out of it saying, "Oh, I see. I did not understand rapier. He came out of that with an entirely different impression of what rapier was and could be." He won crown. All of the fencers are like, "Oh shit, it's rapier." And instead, he was like, "I'm going to fight every war point with you guys. I'm going to show up to your your tournaments and fight in those too. I'm going to, when are you guys doing melee training? I'm going to show up to that too." And that was huge. Personally, I appreciate that. But I think a king who puts that much presence on the rapier field, they can get everybody to go the extra mile.
And they can absolutely turn their reputation around as well. We've had a king like that in the past.
And it is just doing the legwork.
Also, if it makes you feel any better, Brita just popped up on YouTube and said that apparently that king pissed the East off as well.
I'm sure.
They fought for the queen.
And that was what I heard about Anstiora too, that one year. So,
but
this is just Wistric causes interkingdom incidents. Okay?
That's this entire episode. This is
let's go ahead and talk about
without having panelists.
that other one. Yeah.
So,
we need panelists so that they get in trouble.
So we've talked about like a full war, like the charisma of the reign of the command staff that can affect the culture. But can we talk briefly about a battle, the battle type? I know from my time as chief of staff in the Midrealm, I could tell you exactly which kingdom was going to show up in force for the field battle, which kingdom was going to show up in force for the woods battle, and which kingdom would be completely off the map and disappeared for forever for that final day, whether it was a split battle or not. So battle type can definitely, we touched on it actually with the running, so thank you very much, Cal, for asking that question. With the rules negotiations, but the culture of a kingdom can also affect what the rapier populace is willing to participate in. The East loves the woods. The woods at Pennsic is the East's church. Everyone shows up. We have noticed a downswing, though, as the culture has changed a little bit in that kingdom. The Mid loves the field battle for whatever reason. I'm still not 100% on that one, but our numbers are always the strongest, probably because we really emphasize bringing crossovers to that battle, much like Wistric touched on earlier.
Yeah, the Mid wall of knights with their shields at the field battle is always like, and Anstiora pulls that out at Golf Wars.
We're definitely
the Anstioran coffin shield that is this tall. It is exactly the size limit for Golf Wars because Golf Wars limits buckler size. And Bart, when he was on the field, was like, looked at that line and was, Wistric, are those all knights? And yeah, it's like, I'm going to go talk to my brothers. And because there were the Knights of Anstiora turning out. And again, having the king on the field, it's not just like, yay, it inspires the fencers. They get to see kind of what they may have missed up until they had that perspective. And yeah, so to go back to talking about which battles, who shows up to which battles, even within kingdoms, you can know that certain units will and will not show up. Gardner's company in Atlantia is the people I camp with at Pennsic, and they all have needs that they'd rather not risk in the woods. So you don't expect a lot of gardeners to, but they're all like Master Allen, Master Giacomo, like they are all the old mods who have been doing this for 20, 30 years. And they are just fire and forget missiles, and they can go through a line any time they want. But not in the woods, because they won't. They just won't go up there and risk their knees. And you know, so that's the sort of thing. As you see units aging, you'll see whether or not they show up. You'll see. Yeah, you know, and then the schedule starts to play in, as you were talking about there. You all have a 21-hour drive, right? Yeah, from Golf Wars, you're packing out. If there's
No, we pack out everything and keep the armor out and the bag out, and we go to the hotel stinky as hell to take a shower.
That's my Saturday morning.
Yep.
Yeah.
We have got
the one year that they had a battle on Saturday at Pennsic. It was that same thing because it got rained out and pushed back. And that leads to and as in planning, if the woods battle, ravine battle is on Friday, it's going to get rained out. Like it'll rain Tuesday and the woods will be muddy. Okay, that will affect the numbers turnout.
Yep.
And so then you're back to like, okay, go to each of the units. Hey, what are you doing? Will you be there Saturday?
So, and we've talked about this now. So it is it is chief of staff, or what is the title that you made for Meridiers?
Me.
Just Wistric. You need chiefs of staff or Wistric.
That org chart was, if you notice, there's me, there are the 3 regional commanders, and then there were the commanders below them. There's not a chief of staff. There's not currently in the in Meridian.
So the whole job of
Shimon could probably chime up and he'll tell me I'm wrong.
Okay, no, he's been taking notes. It'll be chief of staff. But
good.
Chief of staff.
Listen to Bruce.
That is not, Bruce is not a title. Not a title. But chief of staff's job is to organize everything and make things run smoothly as possible. Keep the flow of information going between the people who need to know it and the people specifically. But they can't control the weather. They can't control the community's culture. And a large part of the job is just about making it easier to melee, about making melee, I won't say better, but more organized, more efficient. Sometimes it's better. Sometimes it's about winning. Whatever you find is most important.
So can we talk about how the Midrealm manages the flow of information at Pennsic?
We absolutely can. And so this was the episode that I think a lot of people, especially Simone, were kind of waiting for, which is to talk about the Midrealm binders.
So last Pennsic I was at, I walked into a friend's camp and was hanging out with her, and then she's like, "Oh yeah, the Midrealm command meeting's like happening over there in 20 minutes." I was like, "Well, let's go watch." And so we walked to the other side of camp and sat down, and I got to witness a marvel, because I'd been to East Kingdom command meetings before. Very different from this. All of the regional commanders and all of the regional sub-commanders and all of, I think, probably the local unit commanders gathered around like 24, 30-foot long table. I mean, like multiple tables laid out end to end. They all sat down. And then the stack of binders came out and was distributed, one for every regional commander or something like that. And they started working their way through the binder. And I thought I'd had too much to drink. But the binders are a thing of just magic.
So I mentioned Mirabai earlier today when talking about the Rapier Command Scholarship, or Rapier, the Midrealm Rapier Scholarship, not Command, sorry. Was reading my outline while trying to talk. Mirabai was Chief of Staff 2-3 ago, and she had started making these binders for the big shots, the XO, the Chief of Staff, and the General, as a way of keeping them all on the same page, making sure that they had contact information so they could find their regional commanders, making sure they had the data from the Rapier survey so that maybe they had a reference for names. I'm not 100% sure on what was included in those original binders. But the Chief of Staff before me, Cecily O'Donnell, I believe is her last name with the SCA. I'm really bad at titles and last names.
You don't say Bruce.
Yeah,
Baroness Alessandra Brucioli.
my name's so short. So the person I inherited the job from, Cecily, is this fabulously organized person, and she started making the binders for everyone, for all of the regionals, for the bigwigs, etc. And when I inherited them, the data, there was just so much data that I actually ended up paring it down a little bit and upping the amount of tools in these binders instead of spoon feeding everything, because at that point, not everyone collects information the same way, which is actually a great tip for your Chief of Staff or whoever you have do this. So if you are spoon feeding information to people, you've got to make sure that it's in a format that their brains will process. So what I did for these binders, and they're infamous now, is...
That's like extra famous.
They're infamous. So if you've ever seen me running at Pennsic and it is not a battle, I am not in armor, and I have a stack of 3 egg crates, one that most likely has the stuff to make margaritas in it, and the other 2 have binders, I'm going to a command meeting. I bring margaritas because it helps everyone process the information. And if they don't drink water for everyone. Thank you, Mara. I couldn't remember if it was O'Donnell or something else very Irish, and I totally blanked, and I love her, and I'm glad that she put these together. She was the chief of staff before me who started putting everything together, but some of the information that the general that she was under was asking her to collect was just a little bit excessive, and not great for everyone to process the information. So when you get to Pennsic and you are a Midrealm ally or general of an ally or on the Midrealm command staff, what you get is a packet. And what I keep in the packet is a set of maps, a Pennsic map. Okay, I can pull this out. I'll have a Pennsic map with a list of contact information. It's usually an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not going to flash that up because it has people's personal information like cell phones and mundane names. As well as
who's camped where?
Yes, as well as who's camped.
I was wondering, given the size of Pennsic, if that was like, yeah, because that seems like it would be necessary.
So not everyone keeps their cell phone on at Pennsic. So what we would do is we would have people say where their camp was on the map, literally point to it so that I knew where to find them if they didn't show up for command meeting and chew them out. I loved my job. So you had a Pennsic map, you had a contact sheet with where people were camped, and what like major lances is what we call them here in the Midrealm. What that really is like your elite units. It's like the Wandering Turnip Farmers, or we've talked about the Wednesday Company before. It's the Thieves of Hearts. It's our big melee groups here in the mid. So we'd also have the contact information for those people in case we needed them at the command meeting or needed to give them special instructions after the command meeting. So the next thing that we would include, so this is one of my older packets, and it's not in the organized format that I actually ended up going with the last couple of years, but it would include, it would include a set of the rules for Pennsic itself, because we were finding that when sometimes things would get a little bit dicey or a little bit messy, it was much easier to pull out the rule set and talk to the marshals about it if we had the rules as printed online. It also helped us determine what type of strategy we could use for certain battles. So if running was allowed, and you had a MacGuffin battle where you had to go pick up all the bags of gold, you have your track stars go do it. But if running was not allowed, you put the people who could battle mosey the fastest at the front with a couple of squads of killers, and you go get those bags of gold. So the next thing I would include would be a set of the scenarios as written on the Pennsic website. I'm sorry. A set of the scenarios with the war points and how much they would count, so that you had something to reference and read through to your commanders. So everyone was on the same page. They knew what the scenario was. They knew what the win condition was, because we've had this discussion before. Scenarios, if you're looking to win, you need to know what the objective is and do the objective and not just go out there and kill people, as much fun as that is. The other
talk about the D&D town battle.
Don't talk about the D&D town battle.
But if you go back to episode 5.
So the other thing that I would include would be a full set of schedule with the blocked off war points. This one was nice. I started highlighting the war points in red after we had a couple of regionals who were late. But this one was in blue, so you know it was early. and I left enough space on them so that they could take notes as to when muster time would be, where we were mustering, and what muster was supposed to look like. AKA, they needed to come find me and give me their troop counts so that I wasn't running around like a maniac. All right, and I know this is so exciting for everyone going through these packets. The other pieces that I would include would be a set of maps that you could draw on. Ooh, ooh, ooh. This is actually 2-scale and gridded Pennsic battlefield, as is set up by the battlefield coordinator every year, with a 2-scale picture of the fort. And I'm not saying I used part of my archaeology degree to use ArcGIS to GIS to trace this, but I did. We also have a set of, well, what year was it? Oh, it was the Broken Field Battle. Set of the maps for the Broken Field Battle, including layout and where objectives were, etc. We also would include sheets of note paper so that people would all be on the same page at the command meeting about what their unit was supposed to be doing. I would also, as chief of staff, take really close notes where they were supposed to be, because inevitably someone's binder might end up in a puddle of water, or they'd leave it in their tent, or they'd get horrendously drunk and not show up to muster. So you'd find their XO and make sure that they knew where their people needed to be. The other stuff that I would usually include in this would be a stopwatch, which I no longer have because I pawned them all off on my replacement, because one of them was definitely still beeping at the end of Pennsic 2 years ago, and I didn't want them in my house anymore. I would also include pens and a dry erasable version of the map, so that we could show how people were supposed to be moving. What else is in here? So, I have my notebook, and I have the AAR forms, which are on this side. Haha, after action reports, where it talks about what you did for that battle and how it went. And that's the other thing that is really fun that's in here is miniature woods map. So the miniature woods map and the draw-on maps, as well as the note paper, were easily the most important things in here. Having the scenario write-ups was great. Having the rule set was great. These are the most pared down version of these binders. This is what would have gone out to our regionals as well as to our allies. Once you get higher up the food chain a little bit, with our generals and our XOs, things would get a little bit more in depth, like write-ups of strategies, discussions, special instructions from the crown, expanded contact info, including allies, and actually opponents too, and marshal in charge. I would make sure I'd had all those just in case something happened, which did a couple of years. I'm really glad I had those. But every single one of these had this set of packets in it. And yes, Brigid made the mini woods map. She's actually the one who gave me like 8 of them to hand out. And then Katja, our training master for the longest time. When we say training master, what we mean is the person who used to write the war camp scenarios and would work very closely with the chief of staff to do that, and the XO and the general and the crown to make sure we were training what they wanted. Printed like 80 of them, and I love her for it. But as chief of staff, your considerations for these binders became a little bit different than the rest of the army. So you'd have the bigwigs with the strategies and the considerations from the crown. And you have all of your regionals with your regular packet. But as chief of staff, you are a kindergarten teacher and a secretary and a logistician and a data gatherer and a hard drive. So this was my solution for the longest time. I had extras of everything. I had a hole punch in here to make sure things could go into people's binders. I had pens, I had paper, I had I had at least 8 extra packets because allies would roll in, roll out, etc. I'd keep AAR forms out the yang because so that AAR form I showed you would have to be filled out by every regional, XO, CO, every commander, so general, XO, etc. They're filled up after every battle. So
Did you have a budget for all this printing?
What?
Did you have a budget for all this printing?
Budget?
I'm wondering, how much money and time did you personally put into like to the binders for a year?
Time, as Pennsic would gear up, it would be easily a full-time job. It was about 40 hours for a couple of weeks, rolling up into Pennsic, putting together the binders, putting together the data, putting together all the contact info, chasing people for their cell phone numbers, chasing people for where they were camping, chasing people for melee, census, etc. Which is why the war camps were so important, because like kind of like you, where you were pinging people individually, I could just roll up to a region who was sitting around their day shade having fun, drinking water in between things and be like, so you coming to Pennsic? Oh, you can't afford Pennsic. Look at the Rapier scholarship. Oh, you don't have the time off. That's fine. Are any of your friends coming? Like, I was a really creepy used car salesman for a couple of hours there during the war camps. But budget-wise, it wasn't too bad because the person, so Cecily before me, was able to print for free. Mirabai was able to print for free because she's a teacher. I paid for my first year, and then I got a job with a company that let me print for free. So it wasn't too bad, but that first year putting in all the money, and part of why I only really have my binder and my accordion folder now is because I passed everything I had, all of the extras, etc., onto my deputy. I made sure that onto my replacement, I made sure that I had at least extras of anything that could be extra to give to him, because I bought a lot of pens. People go through pens like nobody's business, but if you don't bring pens, people won't have pens to write down the plan with, and then you'll be explaining the plan for 2 hours every night at Pennsic. Don't ask me how I know that.
I mean,
I only sound a little crazed.
Right?
Logistics. Yeah.
So I think that gives us an idea of how much effort you're putting into this, and how much, and kind of what it takes in general for a 250 person army to be well organized, well run, well managed, and turn out for a war. So how did or would could you share some of that effort out? How close did you get to burnout? Did you burn out?
So to answer your question there, I definitely experienced a bit of burnout, especially towards the end. I was there a little bit longer than I probably should have. The last couple of chiefs of staff had 2-year terms, and I was there twice as long. But that being said, I was under Mara, who is in the chat. She was the general for that last year, at the last 2 years. Wow, I count good. This is why I'm chief of staff. She was the general for the last 2 years.
What are the enemy numbers? Lots.
Hey, but you find tricks to work around it. And while the last year, 2 years ago now, was one of the toughest years I had been chief of staff because of some royal considerations. We had a king who was very, very involved and very determined to have the war camps effort started back up because he didn't feel that people had the basic training they needed. And to be fair, he was right, but the implementation became a little bit of a clusterfuck because of ideation versus practicality in how we wanted things to be done and how the royals wanted things to be done, and then considerations for the job already at Pennsic. So for me, I experienced burnout, and I think we want to go a little bit more into managing burnout and expectations later. But I'd like to quickly touch on some of the things that made the job easier, which we've touched on a couple of them, but there were other things that people might not consider when doing a job like this for larger wars. So first of all, if you ever see a picture of me chief of staffing, which I'm sure I have a picture somewhere of me eating a Freezy Pop with a whiteboard and binders all around me after the woods battle with my hair in the full on like frizz mane. This bag was the best thing to happen to me as chief of staff. It would always have snacks in it for me, for my regionals, for my troops, whatever, just handful of snack bars, things to go to people when they're starting to fade. It would also have whiteboard markers, pens, and the most important thing of all, which is Pedialyte packets for adults. Oh yeah, give me that look, Wistric. But keeping your staff.
Was that for the mornings when
what?
You didn't want, was that for the mornings when you didn't want some inexperienced rando to have to be chief of staff instead?
No, so honestly, the Pedialyte was more for the regionals who would push themselves too hard, or the generals who had a little bit too much fun the night before, or the royals who were grumpy because they had stayed up all night hobnobbing with other royals, trying to build allies or whatever for Pennsic at Gulf Wars. Yeah, that type of stuff. And as Mara just pointed out, there's also a bag that was given to the general, which is where I actually stole this idea from, that had lifesaver things in it. Snacks, a book of like memories and like thoughts and tips and tricks and whatnot. I think it also had a notebook and a pen in it. But small stuff like that can make the biggest difference. Making sure that your regionals, your deputies, your the people who support you or the people who you need to be thinking straight are able to think straight because they've had their basic needs met. Food, water, painkillers, but I can't really say to give people ibuprofen. Just that makes me feel weird. Keeping that
because
stuff.
You have a legal background. You know what you're risking.
Keeping that stuff around is so important in managing burnout and managing other people's burnout. Just those little things that can make people's lives easier. It's like the barracks tent. It's like the Midrealm Scholarship Fund. The other trick I learned was I became infamous also for having a stack of whiteboards. I mean, I just pulled out whiteboard markers, which this was the bag I had packed for Gulf Wars, by the way. All the binders and stuff that are laying around. I was ready to go right when it got canceled. But for me, the whiteboard was the best trick I found as chief of staff with how fast numbers change at Pennsic, whether a royalty has decided to even up the sides, so you just lost 60 people, 70 people, or whether an ally didn't show up for the command meeting, so they don't know where they're supposed to take their 45 people. Or the scenario is really stupidly complicated and everything has a name that doesn't make any sense because everything's made out of hay bales. And you need to tell people which is which to go down the paths. So my first year as chief of staff was a kind of uneven year, and hearing my friends from the East complain about how we obviously lied about our numbers hit me a little bit harder than it probably should have. But there's a joke in my house that I'm pretty bad at simple math. It's calculus is fine, basic numbers, fuck no. So I wanted a way to be super transparent with the numbers that were coming to the field and make sure that we had the most up-to-date count. So I bought a whiteboard and a marker and started just writing down all of our regions for the mid and then all of our allies and getting like a second by second count and just updating it over and over until basically the cannon went off. I discovered that same year that it was also a great way to show allies and officers where they were supposed to go, because I appreciate many of our allies, but sometimes things get lost in translation at command meetings. And left means right and right means left, and run straight, turn left has a different meaning to Atlantia than every other kingdom, and a different meaning to Aethelmark than any other kingdom. So it made it very easy to demonstrate.
One has different meanings to different kingdoms.
Right. And if you tell a kingdom that's a meandering kingdom to stopgap Atlantia's run, you got to demonstrate that maybe they should come in behind them instead of to the side of them to make sure there's not a giant gap to shoot through for the opponent. So whiteboards and just little tricks and tips like that can make your life so much easier in doing a job like this. Google Drive. Google Drive is brilliant because, and this kind of brings us into the next part of our discussion, which is managing burnout and expectations. But Google Drive for the Midrealm Rapier Army has been a lifesaver because sometimes too much data is worse than too little data in being able to find things. Even before this meeting, I was looking for a couple of infographics that I know we have, but they're not in my Google Drive because they're from before my time, and there's just a pool of documents that ranges from 2011 to 2014. So it gets a little bit confusing about where things should be and are. You got to organize it. You got to find a format that meets your goals. And I guess that's kind of the biggest step for a kingdom in building a melee force is figuring out what your goals are. Is it to have fun? Is it to kick butt? Is it to win? Is it to do all three? And what information do you need to accomplish that?
And even, how much do the royals care about winning? How much do, because they're different stakeholders, and those are all going to be, they might have different objectives and different priorities for, how much you need to care.
As chief of staff, you are basically a walking calculator. And these are all various factors that are going in, and hopefully you're spitting out numbers and useful information, but you got to figure out what the useful information is. And if you spend too much time doing it, it can really affect your ability to do the job effectively. Real life commitments, SCA commitments, like they can all kind of overlap. And it can get kind of messy. I know I hurt a couple of feelings while I was chief of staff, and I still feel horrible about it, but there was no good way to manage everything. And if I could go back in time, I probably would have retired a little bit earlier, just because we hadn't found a good way to share the work. We hadn't implemented like a hard term limit. We still haven't. But everyone knows it should probably be about 2 years because Bruce lost her shit by year 4.
You don't want another Bruce.
Yeah, blame it all on me.
The first 2 years of Bruce, but not that fourth one.
But by year 4, I had kind of lost my shit. And kind of constructive criticism, specifically for the Midrealm, because that's where I'm speaking from. For such a large kingdom, a lot of these jobs should possibly be split into 2. I've actually really enjoyed being XO with my co-XO because it's half the work. We're literally splitting it down the middle, and anything we can't agree on, we walk away for a couple of days, walk back and say, okay, this is what we're doing. Like, that would be, I guess, my one constructive criticism for that. And I guess, and we're getting back into the touchy-feely, but paying attention to what people need and what people want and meeting somewhere in the middle can make all the difference in the world. Small tips and tricks like water, food, painkillers, but also not asking too much of people. For the mid, honestly, chief of staff should probably be 2 people. You should probably have like the data gatherer and the analyst, or the data gatherer, analyst, and the cat herder, because half of my job as chief of staff was running people down to yell at them. Anyway, so that's how I would suggest managing burnout. Wistric, you got any input there? Now that I've talked for like 10 minutes straight.
I'm notorious for trying to do all the things, or at least among some people. And yeah, at the end of the day, what I find is the more you can reduce choice fatigue and executive function demand, which is, if you're not familiar with the concept of decision fatigue, it's this idea that like if you have to decide what color shirt you're wearing that morning, that's a decision. Every time you make a decision, it piles up, and maybe you have, some people use spoon theory. I talk about bandwidth. Today, my bandwidth is this. If I make so many decisions, I'm using up those bits of bandwidth. The more I can preload, the more I can reduce that demand. I like copy and paste. I love me copying and pasting form letters. For when I was Seneschal, I was like, hey, site, how much do you cost? I had an email and I just changed the recipient name. When I was saying, hey, how many people are going to show up at your practice? I copied and pasted the text from the first message I sent to everybody else who got that message. Because it's like, they're not getting, like, I'm not group texting because people ignore group messages. Everybody got the same message as a private message. It's like, I don't have to spend the mental energy to write that. I don't have to spend the time to come up with like, hey dude, how you doing? It's been a while since I've seen you. Fuck that. Like this, hey, how many people from your practice are going to show up to Gulf Wars? Who do you know who? Yeah, and that's why, back to like the project management tools, those are all ways to, instead of putting the burden on yourself in the instant, when you have the bandwidth a year, 8 months before the event, when you're like, I'm not stressed about anything. That's 8 months away. You take the moment to say, these are the milestones that I'll need to meet. This person will need to have done X by this date. You load that into a calculator or into a calendar or Trello again, whatever to-do list, timeline, whatever tool you're using. But that tool means that when that date comes around, when your calendar says, hey, check the status of this, you don't have to go, wait, you don't have to remember on that date to check the status. Technology remembered it for you. I will copy and paste the message that I need to send on that date into my calendar reminder, because I'm just like, I know what and in 3 months I'm gonna have to say this. There, great. So I don't have to think about it. If I've got a meeting that day, if I haven't had enough coffee that day, if I didn't sleep the night before, I don't have to put that burden on 3 months from now, me. Preloading your executive function and minimizing variation. Like I said, copy and paste is fine. That way you're not having to redo the same work over and over again. If you've got a format for the binders, then you just like, this tab is for the rules for Pennsic. Print out the rules, slap them in.
I literally, in the chief of staff folder, the Google Drive that we've been like sparkly shiny eyes about, I literally have a blank forms and maps with the rules for each year. And what I would do is make a new year for Pennsic with the scenarios, the rules, the blank forms and maps that would apply, and have the data survey or the survey data go directly into that folder for that year. Literally would just pull those documents. And once I had that set up, it was fine. But getting that all set up in year one and 2 really contributed to the burnout in 3 and 4. But by 4, I was a well-oiled machine.
And hopefully your successor isn't reinventing the wheel, because then you've saved them from, like, you bit the bullet on that one.
Hopefully, but I also hope that they are taking the time and putting in a little bit of extra energy to improve the system even further, the same way I did, because I know that Cecily had to basically build a wheel. We didn't have a Google Drive. We had a Facebook group, and it wasn't super well organized, but that role was still really being defined at that time. And for Cecily, it really built up. A lot of the information we were gathering, we weren't actually using. So that my first year and my second year, I sat down with the general and XO, who at that time was Mirabai and Mara, and then Mara and Cole. Cole is now the general, and had a really hard discussion about, hey, this is the data we're collecting. Why do we need this? I think you could get these answers by asking this question instead of these 4 questions. And a lot of it was just fine tuning and tweaking once we had a system in place. And that, I think, would be kind of my biggest tip to a chief of staff is think about questions and asking good questions as both looking at the answers you get and the answers you're not given. So the reason we ask, what unit do you fight with? Also, cat, stop eating my lettuce. The reasons we ask, who do you fight with at Pennsic and what region are you a part of, is so that we know how engaged our command staff is in that area. The other part to look for too is what households are up and coming as rapier elite lances. What are we starting to see in the future? So think about how your questions can be used to collect data. And sometimes it's not what you actually ask, but what's left unsaid on the outside. So when you're formulating the data you want to gather, which we're about to go into, how to maybe implement this better in your kingdom, that's a really important thing to think about. So I tried to give us a smooth transition, but I miss our panelists for this because usually they just start talking over me.
Yeah. What's this right now? I have to do something.
Yeah. So let's go into our.
Like, we let them talk until they hit the thing that we want to talk about next.
Yeah, this is the weirdest game of jump rope ever. So I'd like to jump into
collecting the data.
Yeah, I'd like to jump into that.
You know, and I think the comparison of our 2 experiences also shows kind of the data you need is going to vary based on your kingdom, based on your situation. You know, I needed numbers, and I could not get those based on past experience because we just didn't have enough. I needed an organization chart that had, and the one I could put together had a lot of blanks, so I had to do the work to identify some of that basic groundwork. Once you got that developed, though, then you're into you know, how are we going to train for this scenario? How are we going to take the rules and apply them? And how are we going to shape our war camps to best suit what we're facing at war this year? So it varies. Yeah, like everybody's kingdoms, possibly whatever other setting they might be doing this in, is going to be unique to a degree. So the first kind of questions to ask yourself are, what do I actually need to know?
And if you're starting from the ground up, it could be a really good time to have that introspective question with your rapier community about what's important to your kingdom for rapier melee. Are you a principal in a war? Do you want to be the badasses who roll up to a war and every kingdom wants to fight over because you win good? Do you want to make sure that you're the most honorable or the most fun to play with? Like, what do you want your kingdom's melee identity to be? That is a huge question to ask when coming up with a program for collecting data. What's important?
And when collecting data, be aware of a couple of biases that come into data collection. First of all, if you put out a survey, you're going to get selection bias. People self-select whether or not they answer a survey. If you do the legwork to say, hey, I don't have an answer on that survey from these people in your group, then you apply pressure to resolve that. But that's an issue that you're going to have to keep an eye out for. If we know we have this list of authorized fighters and we haven't heard from this list of them, your results are going to be if you're asking what do we want out of melee and half of the people don't answer, it might be because they don't think they can enjoy melee, or they think that they're just going to lose. People are going to say, we want to have fun. Maybe those half of the people are competitive, maybe vice versa. But at the end of but you'll end up with what's then called the next one, survivor bias.
Yeah.
You don't know about the people who don't come back. You don't know why they don't come back.
Well, and that's a big thing too, is even in a principal kingdom like the East or the Midrealm for something like Pennsic, you're constantly reinventing your melee identity. It's why 2 years ago now, it's really hard to remember since there wasn't Pennsic last year, why 2 years ago we had to revisit basic melee training. We had lost a lot of our cohesion and a lot of our unified identity as a war kingdom. People were coming to us with their data saying, oh, we just fight in melee because it's expected, or for the good of the kingdom, or for the war points. Like we actually collected that information so we could know a little bit more about what we wanted to focus on at the war camps and what we wanted to become. And it has changed a little bit over time as the command staff has become fresher faced, I think is a good way to put it. As some of the younger people come in, and as we've had exchange programs with the East and Atlantia and on, where people are mundanely moving. So we're seeing cross-culture pollination. So just remember that it's nothing personal if these questions change, if these considerations change, if your melee identity changes. So be flexible in collecting this data as well. And if you start feeling overwhelmed by the amount of data you've gathered, or underwhelmed, or you realize you're missing something, don't be afraid to admit that you didn't ask the right question. Just fix it for next time. Send it out next year.
Ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
Like, end of the day, even if you're, a command staff of 1 for the army, there are mods who theoretically are there to help lead the community, not necessarily the army. There are scarves who, maybe they've been a scarf for 20 years and they think that they're and they are used to the idea of leading the community, and so they'll be willing to help you. It's going to be a lot of data to collect. It's going to be daunting. It's going to be overwhelming. Chunk it up into smaller sizes and ask for help.
And I'm going to say something unpopular here, since I am not the peer in the chat right now. But it doesn't necessarily have to be one of those people, because in some kingdoms we are finding that a lot of the mods, a lot of the scarves, a lot of the whatever don't particularly like melee because it's not tournament fighting. It's not by the book. Don't be afraid to look for kind of out of the box or unorthodox people to help you too. If you can find someone who is a project manager mundanely and doesn't mind spending a little time teaching you about how to manage a project or how to collect data, tick those boxes. Or find the person who knows everyone because they're the one providing day shade or water or snackies or whatever. Find those people as well. They can help you in more ways than some of the bastions of our community. No offense, Wistric, I love you.
No, straight up. There are charismatic. There are many mods don't always show up to the fighting field, so they don't. And okay, I've had a kid and I'm a Baron now, so I don't actually show up to the fighting field all that much these days. When there was a fighting field, June 2021. But there are the people who do. And if the mods just don't, somebody does. Somebody is the person that is at every event. Somebody is the person that, they're a decent enough fighter. They're out. They are there. They are visible just by dint of showing up. By the way you shape the community is show up, not get a white collar or a scarf. Show up, be vocal, be.
Yep, and
and that person, whoever the hell they are, is a great resource because everybody knows who they are.
And thank you for popping that up, Cal, because I wanted to touch on that. Mara just said you don't need to be a peer in order to do a thing. And it's so true. And one of the biggest boons to being chief of staff for me, where some of my predecessors didn't implement things, they didn't look at some of the resources they had available, because a lot of people end up with peer fear or aren't very happy to tell a king to sit down because they don't know what they're talking about. And I've never had that problem. I have a problem with authority, and it's not great for the SCA some days. But don't be afraid.
It's good for the SCA.
It's not good for me in the SCA some days. Don't be afraid to look at people who might have been overlooked. Some of those people are paying attention and watching where you might not be. So those newer people too can tell you who in their region is being a jerk, and can tell you why they don't necessarily want to fight melee with their region, or can tell you why a household, like, you can get all sorts of information. We're back to intelligence. Like, I feel like KGB bullshit over here. You can find out so much about the pulse of a kingdom by talking to those college students we're throwing in the back of vans and into barracks tents. You can learn so much from the mom friend who feeds everyone. That's data in and of itself. That's soft data. That's stuff that I have a notebook that has notes in it on who I can talk to and what they said at what event in what year, to give me kind of an idea of where our community was going. So maybe you don't need to gather that quite the same way you gather a melee census, but that stuff is important too. So that brings us to our next step, which is figure out how to collate and analyze your data. Too much data.
We've been talking through some of that. Going to the day shade where everybody's hanging out. Doing the reaching out to the person who's not, or who's overlooked, right? Mm-hmm. And then collating is the fun part. So you have a notebook.
Well, so with the collecting the data as well, you can do more general swaths and passes. Like with the Midrealm, we have the Midrealm Rapier Social Club, which is run by one of our former generals, Peter Grau, and Cecily, and now myself as an admin. There's a theme here, all involved in command staff and data and melee. But we usually release our melee census to there. And if I start meeting people at events who haven't filled it out, I'll approach them and ask them, hey, do you have a Facebook? Are you involved in the Midrealm Rapier Social Club? If you're not interested, I can PM it to you, or you can just tell me all this information right here, like whatever's easiest. I've made so many new friends that way. And got really good at.
This is why you know everybody.
No.
That's not why, but you still know everybody.
And then the other part for collating the data, I think I touched on a little bit earlier, but look at the questions that you ask and not necessarily at what the answers you get are, but some of the unanswered things as well. Depending on what your kingdom has decided is important for its melee community could also determine what your most important data is. If you're determined to have fun, knowing the names and the active people and making sure that they stay engaged and active and happy is more important than knowing what their blade length is or what their training is or some of the other stuff we collect like as a principal war kingdom. The other part too is knowing what your crown wants. If you're showing up to Gulf Wars and you're going to be the biggest, baddest force of 35 people from North Shield, I don't know how many people North Shield brings, so I'm just shooting from.
We'll find out in a minute.
If you want to be the biggest, baddest people, maybe the data you need to collect and present is a little bit different. So those are just some considerations for that data. My suggestion is organize everything by year, and within those years, organize everything by the type of data you've collected. So I can go into a file and I know Pennsic blah, blah, blah is going to have at the top the contact sheet for who was in it, the melee survey, the war camp document, and then the scenarios and the rules. The other way to do it too might just be by the type of data you've collected and then doing it by year in there. I like it the other way, but some people might find the other way easier. Not to sound super nerdy, let me adjust my glasses. All right, you want to touch the last bit?
Now that you got all this data, what do you do with it, right? So the hard data, really we hit on a lot of this. If you're getting the survey back and somebody doesn't know what group they're with, well, first of all, you help them find out what group they're with. Second of all, you help them find out why you find out why they don't know what group they're with, and look into whether or not that indicates something problematic in that group or that region. You have the data, so let's say you get everybody's functioning perfectly, everybody knows what group they're with. Then you start, you know whose strengths, who has what strengths. Once you know the scenarios, okay, how did those pair up? Which units could be, which units should focus on training up specific skills more to be more useful, and to an extent, do you have the right commanders in the right positions? If you have a unit that's, hot stick run and gun, and their commander don't run, you might need somebody else. You might want to talk about if there's somebody who could do the shouting from the front with that unit while their commander catches up.
Some of that too is butts and seats. So we are a volunteer organization. We've already talked about burnout tonight. It is real, especially when you're dealing with this much information. Melee is a little bit trickier than tournaments because there's just so many more bodies. Like there's so much more whatever, and no one's keeping track of tournaments. We don't have a fantasy rapier league in the SCA, although that might be a fun app someday. But the burnout can be real with this. And keep in mind that sometimes deferring to other people, whether it's that running unit or allowing a unit like that to be in charge of itself, can come down to the difference between a great commander and an okay commander. A great commander will know what that unit will do, will tell them what to do, and that unit will go do it because the commander knows what to expect from them. That's a huge part of this, is getting to know people and what they will do on the melee field. And we're back to esprit de corps. The other part too, with applying that data and building those scenarios and creating those training programs, is keeping your goals in mind. Don't be afraid to backtrack. Write down your goal, keep it in mind, and don't be afraid to revisit it. It is not a personal failing if you figure out that a question you asked was not the right question. I mentioned that before. Tweak it. And don't put too much red tape on it. Don't be like the Midrealm 5 years ago where we had a form for everything that needed to be stamped in triplicate by the royal seal and then signed off by blah, blah, blah. Keep it simple and easy to organize. That is so, so important. You don't need a survey for everything. Include questions that you might send to a special unit or lance in your big melee survey. Include those questions in one place so that people don't get lost or don't sit there and go, did I already answer this? Because they'll ask that 15, 20 times, even though they haven't, or even though they have 5 times. And you're like, please stop sending me answers, Connor.
I admit, every time I get a reminder for something, I tend to do it. So, or else then say, oh, I should do that. So, yeah, because I'm one of those people. I don't remember things. I wrote it down.
All right. So just to go over that last little bit, if you want to implement this in your kingdom, know your human resources, decide what's important to your kingdom, figure out how to collect and collate your data, and apply that data. Don't be afraid to revisit collecting the data either. Figure out how it's best organized. It could take you a couple of tries. You are not a failure. You are not a bad human being. You're human, and you're trying to gather a lot of information fast. That is always changing. And
don't be afraid to ask for help.
Nope. And don't be afraid.
Drop by the Fighting the World Facebook page and say, I'm trying to figure out this. I asked this, and I'm still confused about what I could do with this.
The fact that
we will tell you. We'll make suggestions. They might not be the right thing to do, but we'll make suggestions.
The fact that Wistric and I were able to hit 2.5 hours on our own with no panelists talking about this thing, we might know a couple of things. We might have been there. We might have done that. We might have bought a couple of T-shirts.
And we know lots of people who know.
And have been there, too.
Because Bruce knows everybody.
That is not the conclusion to this episode.
I'm okay with that being the conclusion.
Oh, you sure you don't want to give your best chief of staff, whatever the hell they called it in Meridia's?
I don't really have one. It's not like it's not really like I show up. My best moment is that I showed up to that Sunday meeting, was like, I can give you the list of names of who will be here for Monday's battle and for Wednesday's battle.
Okay, well, I have 2 no shit there I was stories off the top of my head. All right, so one involves parody, so you can roll your eyes appropriately.
Oh, wait. Well.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
You can feel.
If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat on Facebook or YouTube. And while we are waiting for those questions to come rolling in, no shit, there I was stories. Wistric already passed. So, Bruce.
You're so helpful. Well, it's okay. I've got 2 lined up, so you can borrow one of mine.
Okay.
So my very first year as chief of staff, I had almost finished law school. I was in my final year. I was pasty white. I was out of shape because that school is not meant for people who want to remain active in any way, shape, or form. And I had gone across the field to talk to the opponents about their numbers and share our numbers for their data because they had just started the aide-de-camp program in the East. And I was friends with them, and we were trying to open the borders, be nice. Since millennials are killing Melee the way it used to be by being nicer to each other and trying to improve the game. So I walked across the field. What?
I'm not being nice to people.
I am.
I'm a bit millennial.
That's why we know what VHSs are, Wistric. But Anyway, so I'm walking across the field. I get my numbers to the east, but it took me a little while to find their aide de camp, which is their chief of staff. And it took a little while to get their numbers. And I, of course, was being a little bit bitchy about it because I took my numbers very, very seriously. Had to have all the numbers, had to have all the data so that I could start putting together a graph on who brought what to war, which I now have. And it's awesome because I can tell you exactly how many people within a range of about 10 each kingdom will bring to Pennsic. But that being said, it took them a little while to get me the info, and me being me, I walked across the field with my notebook and my whiteboard, but no mask, no gloves, no whatever. And I start walking across the field, and I'm like, I had like 5 minutes, no big deal, I'm gonna make it. And all of a sudden, I hear the marshals on the radios start calling that Leon was in 30 seconds, and my pasty white, out of shape ass had to book it. I literally saw the smoke come out of the cannons with this whiteboard in my hand over my head going, oh my God, don't shoot. As I'm running across the field, I see like the Midrealm lining up with weapons in hands. I see masks going down and like gorgets being clipped as everyone's readying up. And there's me just waddling across the field, out of breath, out of shape. Like all the Atlanteans were laughing at me. I could hear them down the field. They're like, that's a run. That ain't a run. As I'm watching the smoke, I cross.
Well, they have like Ben Wheeler and Horse and this fucker.
Tall, skinny dudes with legs as long as I am tall. The usual shit. Stork men hit the edge of the boundary and actually ended up like tumbling over the ropes on the Pennsic field right as I heard the boom. So I saw the smoke. I don't know how I made it that last like 100 meters before the cannon went off. It was terrifying. That is actually in my checklist for my chief of staff, which is go around the edge of the field. Do not walk across the middle of the field when you know there's less than 5 minutes to lay on. And then my other one was the one that involved parity. So parity, I was the liaison who got to bring the units over when there wasn't much time. Usually the general would do that, or the XO would do that, or the crown would do that. But we were in the woods, and there wasn't much time. So I tromped over with this entire unit, and me being the dumbass I am, did not have my mask with me. Yet again, there's a theme here. Always bring your mask. Did not have my mask with me yet.
Adulthood for the mask should just be regalia for the XO, apparently. Or for the chief of staff, apparently.
We don't have... So... Chief of Staff does not get regalia in the Midrealm Army. Well, they do not even get stars. Yeah, it's a good job. But I walked across the field with this unit, and I dropped them off to the east. In the meanwhile, insulting the king because he was wearing my friend's armor, and I thought it was my friend. And I was like, what the fuck are you doing over here? You weren't traded. And everyone from the east just looked at me and was like, that's our king. And I'm like, he is wearing my friend's armor. I am so sorry, Your Majesty.
Kings have arms they're supposed to wear.
I know.
Reason.
Hey, he was supporting the rapier community though. But it's just, I had never seen so many Easterners offended that I had said fuck in front of a king. So that was the first part. And then the second part is I'm tromping back through the woods after dropping these people off. And I'm like trying to do the math in my head because I had just dropped off 15 people to make it pair between 10% or 5% or whatever the hell it was. And all of a sudden one of the marshals goes, hey, Bruce, is that you? Are you marshaling? And I'm like, no. And he's like, well, the cannon just went off. Really? And I'm at the second flag in the woods. So the way the woods is set up, 1 flag, 2 flag, 3 flag. I am nowhere near the boundaries. So I had to have a marshal escort me to the deer path to take me back to rest for the woods battle. And it was the worst experience ever. So embarrassing. It was like being in trouble and having to go to detention. Like, I was in trouble. And I got in trouble with the marshals afterwards. They were like, "What are you doing? Traveling in the woods with no mask?" I'm like, my job. My very sad job.
I'm just saying, you just made another argument for not evening up the sides.
What?
Well, we got you in trouble.
I mean, they could have walked over by themselves, but it just didn't seem right. Like, they were already upset that they were being traded because they were one of the Midrealm units, because we're very specific on not trading allies. They were upset about being traded. Like, it felt wrong not to go over and introduce them. Maybe I should have just stayed on their side.
They kill your friends.
But
although again, everybody's your friend, so I guess you always get to kill your friends. Because Bruce knows everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thanks. I'm glad that made you laugh. Well, those were my no shit there I was stories. Definitely not as exciting as some of our past ones, but if you're ever chief of staff, don't go anywhere without your helmet.
Doesn't look like we've had any questions come through from chat, so I guess it's wrap-up time. Thank you all. If you go to the Facebook event for this, I've posted a link to a Zoom. We're gonna leave here, go join the Zoom. Don't forget to like and subscribe on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you appreciate Kal providing this technical support, hopefully upping our game for us, there is a Patreon, and he supports, he runs tech for Outlands Royalty, for us, for a couple of other shows. A whole bunch of the SCA is benefiting from his hard work and money that's coming out of his pocket for this, for the StreamYard membership. We'll get that link to that Patreon out there on our Fighting the World Facebook page. If you can, please help a brother out. There it is. And thank you all.
All right. Please don't forget to tune in next week. We are hopefully having a very exciting Bardic episode of all things. Wistric has convinced me to sing with him as a duet, not a solo, as our intro. So that's going to be a hot, hot mess. But if you have any rapier related,
she knows how to sing. I don't.
If you have any rapier related songs, poems, bardic-y things, I don't really come from areas with much bardic culture, but if you do, we'd love to have you on the show. We're going to be kind of running it a bit like a variety show, so if you ping us, we'll give you a time slot and you can come perform.
We have some guests that we've identified, but we also just want to hang out and drink cocoa in our onesies with our friends and listen to good music.
Wistric made me buy a onesie, so yeah.
It's adorable. It's gonna be great. So next week, cocoa, onesies, and Bardic.
Yep.
Join us.
And we will be back on Zoom for that one. But if you like the new format, please let us know. We're kind of hoping you do, because this made our lives a little bit easier in some ways. We do miss seeing your faces, though. So
that's why we're going to Zoom.
Thank you guys for joining us, and we hope we'll see you next week.